Have you ever stopped to think how someone's life can change in a matter of seconds without any warning? Imagine a young college student full of dreams, with her life ahead of her, walking across campus on an ordinary afternoon, and suddenly disappearing without a trace. It's hard to believe, but it happened, and what you're about to discover may surprise you. Stay with me until the end, because this case isn't just another disappearance. It's a mystery that stirs the minds and hearts of everyone trying to understand what really happened. She was 21 years old, studying at one of the city's most traditional universities, and was known for her friendliness and dedication. Her friends described her as determined, curious, and always ready to help. Her routine was simple, but full of small routines that made her unique. She spent her mornings in classes and labs, studied in the library in the afternoons, and loved walking around campus, breathing in the fresh air and observing life around her. To those who knew her, everything seemed normal on that fateful day, until something irreversibly changed. On that particular day, she left home with her usual backpack filled with books and notebooks, greeted neighbors and classmates, and followed her familiar route to the university. Everything seemed normal. The sun shone through light clouds, the distant sound of conversations and footsteps filled the air, and the campus was bustling as usual. But amidst these seemingly normal hours, something happened that no one could have predicted. The classmates who last saw her noticed nothing unusual. She smiled, said goodbye, and continued on her way, never imagining that it would be the last time anyone would see her like this. The disappearance happened almost imperceptibly, and the lack of clear signs only deepened the mystery. There were no direct witnesses to what happened, and every detail that might have helped locate the young woman seemed lost in the air. Friends and family quickly realized something was wrong, but even with initial searches, nothing was found. What should have been a simple routine turned into a harrowing investigation, with questions that remain unanswered to this day. As we try to understand this disappearance, it's impossible not to connect with her life, to imagine her routines, her conversations, her small daily habits. Every simple gesture, every path she took around campus has now become pieces of a puzzle no one has been able to put together. And it's precisely this closeness to the victim, this feeling that we might know her, that makes the mystery all the more disturbing and engaging. Have you ever been in a situation where something seemed perfectly normal, and then suddenly everything changes? That's exactly the feeling that accompanies this case study. Every detail, from the exact time she was last seen to the way she said goodbye to her friends, is carefully analyzed, because every missed clue can be crucial. And when we look at disappearances linked to little-known serial killers, we begin to realize that what seemed isolated may actually have unexpected and frightening connections. As we explore this story, it's important to pay attention to the small details, the position of objects, the places she frequented, and the people who came into contact with her that day. Each element could be the key to understanding what really happened that fateful afternoon. And each piece of information that emerges adds a layer of suspense that keeps this mystery alive to this day. Now, let's begin to delve into the first discoveries and clues, exploring the final moments leading up to the disappearance and analyzing every detail that might reveal something that has gone unnoticed until now. Have you ever imagined the feeling of realizing someone you love has simply disappeared without a trace? One moment you're talking to them, observing their daily routine, and the next everything vanishes and silence replaces answers. That's exactly what happened to the young university student whose disappearance shocked family, friends, and the entire academic community. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover now could completely change the way you view these cases. And the initial investigation reveals details no one expected. When her family realized something was wrong, despair took over. They immediately filed a police report, alerted neighbors and friends, and began searching for her everywhere the student frequented. Every minute felt like an eternity, and the feeling of helplessness grew as time passed without any concrete leads. The police arrived quickly, but despite their best efforts, the first few days proved confusing and full of unanswered questions. What makes this case even more intriguing are the first clues that emerged almost imperceptibly. A book left open in the library, a phone that rang unanswered, messages that seemed to have been deleted. Every small but significant detail began to form a pattern that no one could fully decipher. At the same time, suspicions arose that indicated something darker might be going on, something beyond the simple routine of a college student. Have you ever experienced this, encountering situations where normality suddenly shatters and nothing seems to make sense? That's precisely the feeling that permeates every stage of this investigation. Early on, some flaws in the search process drew attention. Conflicting witness information, delayed reports, and seemingly superficial procedures increased the frustration of family and friends. It was as if, behind the official efforts, the mystery was being protected by invisible layers, making the truth even more difficult to reach. Each interview conducted, each police report, seemed to reveal more questions than answers, reinforcing the idea that something much larger was at stake. While the police tried to gather information, family members searched for alternatives on their own, following clues and trying to understand the logic of a disappearance that seemed illogical. Every street they walked, every conversation with colleagues, was a desperate attempt to fill in gaps that no one else seemed to notice. And it is at this point that the case begins to reveal its complexity. Details that at first glance seemed irrelevant could actually be the key to understanding what really happened to the young woman. What makes this initial investigation fascinating is precisely the sense of injustice and suspense it generates. It's impossible not to feel the frustration of those seeking answers and finding only silence. And when we look at true crime cases and historical mysteries involving little-known serial killers, we realize that early clues are often ignored, misinterpreted, or simply disappear, leaving the mystery's trail even deeper and more disturbing. As we continue this story, we'll begin to analyze every detail that emerged during the initial searches, every suspicion that began to be raised, and every flaw that left unanswered questions. What you'll discover now will show that behind a disappearance, there's much more than meets the eye, and that each step of the initial investigation reveals shadows that few dare to face. And it is at this point that we begin to delve into something even more disturbing, the first signs that this case could be linked to something much bigger, something that no one expected. Have you ever wondered what happens when someone crosses paths with a truly dangerous mind, but no one even notices? Imagine that, amidst the routine of a college campus, a young student disappears without a trace, and soon a shadow emerges that few dare name. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover could completely change the way you view disappearances and seemingly isolated crimes. In the first days after the disappearance, police and family members focused on searches, interviews, and routine investigations. But as details began to emerge, certain patterns began to emerge, patterns that weren't just coincidences, but signs of something much more sinister. And this is where a figure few know about enters, a little-known serial killer, someone who operated in the shadows, leaving subtle trails and clues that escaped most attention. He isn't as famous as the big names in criminology, but his presence is documented in similar cases, disappearances that, at first glance, seemed unrelated. What stands out about this suspect isn't just the number of victims or his behavior, but his almost obsessive care in remaining unnoticed. Small, odd behaviors, seemingly innocent habits, and a meticulous attention to the victim's movements, all of this began to paint a disturbing picture. For the most attentive investigators, certain signs couldn't be ignored. Reports of people seeing him near the disappearance sites, suspicious communication patterns, and stories that didn't add up. Each new piece of information added a layer of tension and mystery. making it clear that we were dealing with someone meticulous, calculating, and very difficult to track. Have you ever been in a situation where you feel something is wrong, but no one believes you? This is exactly how the investigation begins to reveal the presence of this serial killer: discrete clues, reticent witnesses, and behaviors that seem normal at first glance, but which, when examined more closely, point to something much darker. This is the kind of case that leaves investigators and family members on constant alert, always suspicious of every detail, every suspicious action, because they know they may be dealing with someone who plans every move with precision. The mystery deepens when we realize that because he is little known, this criminal has never received media attention, never been the focus of documentaries or popular studies. And precisely for this reason, many of his crimes remain obscure. The disappearance of the college student is just one piece of a larger puzzle, evidence that patterns exist that go unnoticed for years. And it is this obscurity that heightens the tension. While everyone searches for answers, this serial killer's mind continues to operate in the shadows, almost invisible yet terrifyingly present. As we delve deeper into this case, each clue connecting the missing young woman to this little-known individual gains enormous weight. Small details, like the time he appeared in certain places or reports of strange behavior from neighbors, begin to create a narrative few have dared to trace. And even without all the answers, the feeling that we're dealing with something much bigger than a simple disappearance holds our attention, sparks curiosity, and makes us wonder, what else is hidden between the lines of this investigation? Now, as we analyze this suspect's life and its possible connections to other disappearances, we realize that the story becomes even more disturbing. Every gesture, every repeated pattern, every seemingly innocent action begins to reveal layers of the mystery that no one had noticed before. And it is precisely this enigma that leads us to explore the next steps of the investigation, seeking to understand not only what happened to the college student, but also who is truly behind crimes that have remained hidden for so long. Have you ever wondered what happens when each new clue in a disappearance seems to raise more questions than answers? Imagine closely following the investigation of a young college student who vanished without a trace, and realizing that the more you uncover, the more confusing and intriguing everything becomes. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover could completely change the way you view disappearances and true crime cases, revealing layers most never even imagined. As the investigation progressed, theories began to emerge, dividing experts, family members, and researchers. Some believed the student's disappearance might have been planned, perhaps a deliberate escape motivated by personal reasons unknown to anyone. Others suspected something much darker, that the young woman had crossed paths with a little-known serial killer, someone who operated meticulously and left almost imperceptible traces. Each new clue brought different interpretations, and what seemed like a straightforward case began to transform into a veritable labyrinth of possibilities. Testimonies from colleagues and neighbors revealed strange behavior that, at first glance, seemed insignificant, but which, upon closer inspection, raised suspicions. A cut-off conversation, an unexpected presence in places near campus, subtle signs that no one noticed at the time could hold the key to the case. And when we look at reports from criminology experts, we realize that similar patterns have emerged in previous disappearances, connecting what seemed isolated to a series of events that no one dared to openly relate. Have you ever been in situations where small details only come to your attention later when it's too late? That's exactly the feeling that accompanies the investigation of this case. Every photograph, every message, every time stamp becomes crucial in trying to understand what really happened. And it's precisely this interplay of clues and conflicting interpretations that keeps the mystery alive, leaving family members and investigators in constant tension, Older reports on the case already pointed to inconsistencies in the timeline, contradictory testimonies, and events that didn't fit together logically. Experts have commented that disappearances involving young and vulnerable individuals often follow subtle patterns that only become evident with detailed analysis. And in this particular case, attention to the smallest details can reveal connections that no one else noticed, revealing a frightening picture behind the young woman's apparent college routine. As the investigation deepened, even more disturbing hypotheses emerged. The possibility that the disappearance was the work of someone skilled in manipulating evidence, an individual capable of operating in the shadows without being noticed. Each new theory increased the complexity of the case, and each statement, each interview, added more layers of tension, making it clear that the truth was far from easy to reach. What makes this moment in history so captivating is the sense that every detail could be decisive. Something seemingly small, overlooked at the time, could be the missing link connecting the student's disappearance to something larger, something that defies logic and the sense of security we all believe we have. And it's this uncertainty, this constant alternation between possible explanations and still unsolved mysteries, that keeps our attention, sparks curiosity, and makes us wonder what really happened on that fateful night. Now, as we explore these twists and turns and theories more deeply, we begin to realize that the case goes far beyond a simple disappearance, revealing layers of secrets and mysteries that few have dared to investigate. Each emerging clue promises answers, but also raises new questions, keeping the viewer on the brink of discovery. Have you ever wondered how a person's disappearance forever changes the lives of those around them? Imagine the pain of family members who every day live with uncertainty, unsure if they'll hear from them, without receiving any concrete answers. In the case of this young college student, the impact was immediate and devastating. Stay with me until the end, because what you'll discover now may reveal not only the complexity of the mystery, but also the emotional impact a disappearance can have, affecting lives far beyond the direct victim. The first few days of his absence were the most distressing. Family, friends, and university colleagues were plunged into a state of constant tension. Every phone call, every message received carried with it the hope of news, and at the same time, the fear of a greater tragedy. Professors and staff at the institution also felt the weight of his disappearance. Everyday events like classes and meetings became marked by worry and insecurity, and the campus that once seemed safe became a place fraught with uncertainty. The feeling of vulnerability spread quickly, demonstrating that the effects of a disappearance extend far beyond the family sphere, reaching an entire community. As police and investigators searched for clues, the academic community began to wonder, was it possible that someone so close could disappear without a trace? Local media began reporting similar cases, small stories of disappearances that seemed isolated, but when analyzed collectively, began to raise suspicions about patterns of behavior among little-known criminals, including serial killers who operate in the shadows, leaving subtle, almost imperceptible traces. Each news story, each old account, heightened the tension, and the fear that something similar could happen to other students began to grow. Have you ever experienced situations where fear and uncertainty become part of your daily life, even without knowing exactly where they come from? This is exactly the feeling the student's family faced, and it spread throughout the campus and the local community. Friends reported sleepless nights, constant worry, and the feeling that something was wrong, even when everything seemed normal. The lack of answers and lack of clarity further heightened the feeling of helplessness, making every little detail even more crucial. Similar cases began to emerge as investigators connected patterns of disappearances to the actions of little-known criminals. Serial killers who remain out of the media spotlight often operate silently, their victims going unnoticed for years. Each new disappearance seemed to repeat certain elements. Young women alone, everyday commutes, seemingly safe places that become traps. And this repetition generated a sense of alert, a silent fear that affected not only families, but the entire academic community and neighborhood. The emotional impact of this case is profound. It reveals how a disappearance can alter relationships, transform routines, and leave invisible scars on everyone close to them. The community began to see previously ignored vulnerabilities, with each disappearance story connecting, directly or indirectly, to a larger web of mystery that defies comprehension. And even with ongoing investigations, the feeling of insecurity and perplexity remained, reinforcing that the disappearance of a young woman is not just an isolated incident, but an event capable of generating waves of tension and reflection for a long time. As we reflect on these consequences, we realize that this case isn't just about a missing student, but about the human impact that stories of disappearances and little-known crimes can have. Every emotion, every reaction, every silent fear that gripped family, friends, and the community builds an intense, engaging, and above all, deeply human narrative. Now, as we explore the next elements of the case, we begin to delve into details that show how these consequences may reveal important clues, and how the mystery remains alive, waiting to be solved. Have you ever imagined what it's like to live with a question that never finds an answer? A mystery that spans years, carrying not only the pain of a young college student's disappearance, but also the weight of an enigma that insists on remaining in the shadows? This case, which seemed straightforward in the early days of the investigation, soon transformed into something much more disturbing, involving theories of little-known serial killers, disconnected clues, and silences that speak louder than any testimony. Stay with me until the end, because what you discover now may surprise you, and perhaps even make you rethink how you view justice and truth. The official investigations dragged on, riddled with flaws, sudden closures, and information that was never confirmed. Contradictory reports emerged constantly. Neighbors who swore they'd seen the young woman in a certain location, friends who claimed she'd seemed unwell in recent days, even alleged sightings that later led nowhere. Have you ever experienced this? Feeling like all the pieces are in front of you, but as you try to piece the puzzle together, you realize there's always a crucial piece missing. This was precisely the feeling that gripped the family, the academic community, and even some independent investigators who delved into the case. Most disturbingly, even as time passed, even more disturbing details emerged. Old documents, forgotten reports, and testimonies that almost no one had paid attention to began to be revisited. A pattern began to emerge, other disappearances in different regions that bore frightening similarities to this one. Young students, similar profiles, seemingly harmless trajectories, but all linked by strange and still unexplained circumstances. This is where the theory of little-known serial killers gains traction. And this isn't just sensationalist speculation. Several criminology experts have pointed out that the killers least publicized by the media are often the most dangerous, because they operate under the radar, in the shadows, without drawing attention to themselves. What no one realized at the time may be the very key to this mystery. The lack of official answers, the silence of the authorities, and the lack of media coverage created fertile ground for doubt to grow. And the more time passes, the harder it becomes to separate truth from rumors. Witnesses age, memories fade, and the case is slowly being swallowed by oblivion. But at the same time, new details continue to emerge, as if this disappearance were just the tip of a much larger iceberg. Stay with me until the end, because the question that looms over all of this is inevitable. Will the truth ever come to light? Or is this mystery destined to remain forever hidden in the shadows, like so many others involving true crimes and serial killers that almost no one knows about? Each element you'll hear next may not only reopen old wounds, but also spark new questions that may never have been asked. This case isn't just about a missing student. It's about the fragility of our sense of security, how silence can be as disturbing as an answer, and how certain secrets endure. The mystery lingers like an invisible presence, always reminding us that there are stories that refuse to be forgotten. And now, as we move forward, you will realize how every detail of this disappearance connects to something bigger and perhaps darker than anyone imagined. And perhaps it's precisely this silence that's most disturbing, because when answers don't come, the mind seeks to fill them with hypotheses, theories, and even its own fears. Each person who follows this case ends up creating their own version of the truth, based on the most striking details, the flaws in the investigation, or the disturbing coincidences that seem to repeat themselves. And this is where an important point comes in. How do you interpret all this? What do you think when faced with a story that seems to have no end, that insists on defying any logical explanation? If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below with what's touched you most so far, or what your theory is about this disappearance. Believe me, your perspective can open up new reflections and even bring forth connections no one had previously considered. It's precisely this exchange that creates a community around such impactful stories. And each shared opinion becomes part of this collective investigation that continues to thrive even so many years later. And of course, if you're feeling this immersion, if this atmosphere of mystery and suspense captures your attention, don't forget to leave a like. It may seem simple, but this gesture shows that this content is valuable to you, and that's what helps the channel continue to bring real stories that have often been forgotten or hidden. Your support is the force that keeps this narrative alive and pushes the message so it reaches more people who, like you, seek answers to mysteries that seem unattainable. And if you're not yet part of this journey, subscribe to the channel now. This way, you'll be able to follow every new episode, every investigation, and every detail we bring to light. Because this is just a piece of the story, and what's yet to come could be even more surprising. Your subscription is more than a number. It's proof that there's a community interested in giving a voice to these cases and preventing them from being forgotten. Now, as we move forward, prepare to delve even deeper into the points the investigation left open, the details many chose to ignore, and the questions that continue to echo to this day. On a seemingly ordinary night, a young college student left the college library and was never seen again. How could something like this happen in the information age, when cameras are everywhere, cell phones record every step, and social media reveals intimate details of anyone's life? This is the first question that echoes in the minds of anyone familiar with this case. How could someone simply vanish without a trace? And even more disturbing, who could be behind this disappearance? Was it simply a dark coincidence, or are we facing a hidden truth, the kind that prefers to be buried under the weight of silence? This kind of mystery isn't just about what happened to a victim. It forces us to reflect on our own choices, on the impact of our daily decisions, and on how the line between safety and danger can be much thinner than we imagine. Have you ever thought about this? Have you ever wondered if seemingly ordinary routines, taking the same bus, walking down the same street, encountering the same people, can hide risks we only realize when it's too late? This student's story is more than a disappearance. It's a portrait of vulnerability, but also of repeated negligence, of mistakes that could have been avoided. And as we delve into these details, it's impossible not to feel we're facing something bigger, a plot involving power, behind-the-scenes investigations, and above all, questions that have never been answered. Because when we talk about true crimes, especially those linked to little-known serial killers, we're not just revisiting past events. We're also exposing how uncomfortable, disturbing, and, in many cases, hidden the truth can be. There's one thing we can't ignore. Crimes that remain unsolved exert a strange fascination over us. It's as if the mind tirelessly seeks to fill the gaps with theories, as if the brain refuses to accept the void of uncertainty. And perhaps that's why this case remains alive to this day. Because every loose detail, every contradictory testimony, every abandoned clue creates room for new interpretations. Did someone really know more than they said? Was the silence of certain witnesses simply fear, or was there something to protect? Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because when we talk about mysterious disappearances, we're not just dealing with facts and dates. We're dealing with a psychological journey, both for the victim and for those left behind. Imagine family members receiving the news that their daughter, their sister, their friend simply hasn't returned home. The initial shock soon turns to despair, tireless searches, and sleepless nights. With each phone ring, hope is reborn and then dies again. It's a painful transformation that marks the lives of those who remain, and it's at this point that we understand that a crime never affects just one person. It creates ripples that spread, affecting entire communities, shaking the collective psyche and leaving scars that never heal. And here's something even more disturbing. In many of these cases, the culprits aren't invisible strangers, but people who circulate in the same space, who share the same routine, who go unnoticed in the crowd. Little-known serial killers often construct a facade of normality precisely to avoid arousing suspicion. They hide in the details, in common gestures, in banal attitudes that make anyone believe there's no danger. But all it takes is a closer look, a pattern, and the connection of seemingly unconnected pieces for the mask to begin to slip. This particular disappearance brings up precisely this unsettling feeling, that there were signs, small pieces of evidence that could have revealed the gravity of the situation sooner. And it's impossible not to consider the impact this has on those studying the case today. The deeper we delve, the more we realize that the line between mystery and revelation is extremely thin. Sometimes all it takes is one ignored clue, one poorly made decision, for an entire story to be diverted from the path of truth. And if there's one thing that makes this narrative so powerful, it's precisely the fact that it's not closed. Each revelation brings with it new questions. Each attempt at an explanation opens the door to even more complex theories. And it's in this space of uncertainty that this story's power lies. Because, in the end, it's not just about the disappearance of a college student. It's about trust, about what we believe is safe, about the behind-the-scenes nature of investigations that never reach a satisfactory conclusion. It speaks to our own need to seek answers, even when they seem unattainable. What you'll realize throughout this dive is that we're not just dealing with a crime narrative, but a human enigma. An enigma that touches on questions of mindset, personal and collective transformation, and how we deal with absence and silence. And it's this combination that makes this story so disturbing and so hard to forget. Comment here. That makes sense to me. I want to see how much this reflection resonates with you, because from here on, the revelations become even deeper. She was only 21 years old, in the prime of her youth, and carrying with her all the dreams a college student typically has. Her name could be that of anyone close to you, someone who walks the college hallways, carrying heavy books, a backpack full of notes, and that look that blends tiredness and hope. She was dedicated, always present in class, with above-average grades and a personality that inspired those around her. Professors remember her easy smile, classmates recall her generosity, and her family was a source of pride. But on a night that should have been completely ordinary, her routine became a mystery that to this day no one has been able to decipher. The university where she studied was in a busy area, surrounded by bars, small restaurants, and always crowded bus stops. The day she disappeared began like any other. Classes in the morning, library in the afternoon, and a quick coffee stop with colleagues. She wasn't one to be late, nor did she fail to let her family know when she would be arriving late. So when the last text message from her cell phone simply said, "I'm on my way," it seemed certain she would be home in a few minutes. But that was the last contact. The person who last saw her reported leaving the library around 9:30 in the evening. The weather was mild, with a light drizzle that dampened the asphalt and cast orange reflections on the streetlights. She wore a dark blue coat, carried a bag filled with notebooks, and walked toward the nearest bus stop. A journey lasting just a few minutes, made countless times. Nothing about the scene seemed out of the ordinary. Yet it was precisely in that brief interval that she disappeared. Imagine this scene. A familiar space, traveled so many times, suddenly becomes the stage for an unsolved mystery. It's as if everyday life had been interrupted by an invisible force, a dark decision that forever changed that young woman's journey. Anyone who passed the same route that night remembers only small, scattered details. A car parked in an odd spot, a man watching from a distance, an unusual silence for that hour. Nothing that in isolation would seem alarming, but in retrospect it fits together into a disturbing puzzle, and it's precisely this lack of clear answers that creates an impact. When we look at her routine, we see how predictable every step was. Classes, studies, friends, family. Nothing indicated a planned escape or unusual behavior. This normality, in a way, makes the case even more disturbing. After all, if someone so connected, so integrated into their community can simply disappear, what does this tell us about the fragility of our own security? There's something almost symbolic about this narrative. A young woman who dedicated her life to knowledge, who believed in personal transformation through education, ends up falling victim to a hidden truth, hidden precisely in the shadows of what seemed ordinary. And perhaps that's why her story remains in the collective memory, because it's not just about crime statistics. It's about a real person, with a name, a face, dreams and plans brutally cut short. That night's journey raises questions that still resonate. Who was the last person to actually speak to her? What happened between leaving the library and the bus ride? And why, despite so many investigative resources, have no definitive leads been found? This feeling of emptiness is like an open wound, unhealed because there was no closure, no truth revealed. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because when we revisit the details of that night, we're not just recounting facts. We're going behind the scenes of what hasn't been explained, the exact point where reality meets mystery, and where the observer's mindset needs to shift to understand how every small choice, every seemingly trivial detail, can hold within itself the keys to a greater revelation. Comment here. I'm on this journey too. I want to see who is really willing to follow each piece of this puzzle, because from now on, the details become even more revealing. The morning after her disappearance, the silence that had gripped the young college student's life began to turn to despair for her family. The clock ticked faster than ever, and each hour without news felt like an eternity. Her distressed parents were the first to call her closest friends, trying to piece together the last pieces of this puzzle that no one yet understood. And when they finally realized there was no answer, the only inevitable decision remained: to file a police report. This is always the point at which hope still mingles with disbelief. That feeling that maybe she was just late, maybe she was somewhere without a signal, maybe it was all just a misunderstanding. But the more time passed, the clearer the hidden truth became. Something serious had happened. The police were called, and the first hours of an investigation are always crucial. It's at this point that seemingly trivial details can make all the difference. The weather was cloudy, and the light rain the night before could have erased important tracks, which already presented investigators with a difficult challenge. Even so, they began mapping the young woman's last steps, leaving the university, walking toward the bus stop, meeting a friend along the way. Everything seemed normal until, somewhere between routine and the unexpected, the trail disappeared. The police's initial reaction was to follow protocol. They spoke to family members, interviewed classmates, and searched for security camera footage in the area. Some showed distant figures, but nothing that actually confirmed where she had gone. What was even stranger was the emptiness, the absence of direct witnesses who could indicate what happened in the final stretch of the journey. It was as if the student had been swallowed by the city's very silence. This lack of immediate answers gave rise to suspicions. And here lies a crucial point. In cases like this, the investigation isn't limited to searching for a person, but also to confronting versions, emotions, and even lies. The family began to question, could someone close to her be involved? Was there something hidden that she had never revealed? These questions stemmed not only from desperation, but also from the need to understand a puzzle that made no sense. And when the police analyzed her last cell phone conversations, clues emerged that further heightened the intrigue. Incomplete messages, missed calls, and a cryptic notification that seemed to indicate she was planning to meet someone that night. Who could this person be? A friend, a classmate, or someone she didn't want others to know about? Meanwhile, local newspapers began covering the disappearance. It was the beginning of a narrative that transcended the confines of private life and became something public, collective. The impact was not only on the young woman's absence, but on the sense of vulnerability that affected anyone involved in the story. After all, if something like this could happen to an ordinary person on an ordinary day, what guarantees that it couldn't happen to any of us? This is the moment when the case ceases to be just a police report and becomes an open wound in the community. But it's precisely when the pressure mounts that the investigations behind the scenes details begin to show their flaws. There was a delay in cross-checking witness records, a delay in analyzing camera footage, and a delay in giving weight to the family's warning. This slowness fueled anguish and gave rise to speculation. Some neighbors claimed to have seen a dark van parked near the university. Others claimed to have heard muffled screams that night. However, none of this information was officially confirmed. The truth always seemed to slip through our fingers, like sand slipping through an hourglass. This confusing beginning was what ignited curiosity and indignation. How could such a sudden disappearance yield so few answers? Why, even with so many investigative tools, was there no clear path? The feeling was that with each attempt to find a solution, a new layer of mystery emerged, as if someone were intentionally manipulating the pieces of this puzzle. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it is at this point that the investigation begins to reveal not only what was done, but also what was left undone. The failures, the misguided decisions, and the choices that may have completely changed the course of this story. It is on this unstable terrain, between facts and omissions, that the journey takes on even darker contours, and that the fine line between justice and oblivion becomes frighteningly real. Right there. I'm on this journey too. It was in this scenario of uncertainty and failure that a new element began to gain traction within the investigation. The possibility that the disappearance was not an isolated incident. Among the stacks of reports and statements, some attentive investigators began to notice disturbing similarities with other records archived behind the scenes at the police station. Old incidents that had never been covered in the press, precisely because they seemed to have no direct connection. But there was something there, an almost invisible thread connecting situations that, at first glance, seemed scattered across time and space, and it is at this point that the figure of a man enters the scene, someone who until then had been unknown outside the cold confines of criminal records. He wasn't in the mainstream news, hadn't been explored by sensationalist programs, wasn't remembered like the names that have become almost mythological in the world of serial crimes. This was a little-known serial killer who operated in the shadows, leaving minimal traces and preferring obscurity to spectacle. His story wasn't plastered on magazine covers, but in forgotten fragments of interrupted investigations and in notes that rarely reached the public. What caught the investigators' attention were the subtle patterns. Young women, mostly college students, disappeared on short trips, usually between school and home. The times varied, but almost always coincided with quieter streets. There were no clear signs of a struggle, no significant remains at the scene. The disappearance was clean, silent, and calculated. It was as if this man had developed a cold, methodical mindset, shaped by decisions always designed to avoid leaving a trace, as if the very absence of evidence were part of his signature. In one of these files, there were reports of a man with strange behavior who often hung around universities and student hostels. He didn't attract attention because of his appearance. On the contrary, he easily blended in with any other ordinary adult. This was his mask, social invisibility. He managed to move around without arousing suspicion precisely because he didn't seem to fit the caricature of a predator. The hidden truth was even more disturbing. He was someone who knew how to move behind the scenes of other people's routines, observing, waiting, choosing the exact moment to strike. Details began to emerge. Old cameras had shown the silhouette of a man walking a few meters behind one of the victims in previous cases, but the low resolution prevented identification. Witnesses claimed to have seen a discreet car, always parked on streets adjacent to universities, without ever associating it with anything criminal. This pattern, seemingly invisible in everyday life, began to reveal itself as investigators pieced it together. And as more information emerged, the more this suspect's name appeared in internal documents, albeit always with an aura of uncertainty and mystery. The academic community, which had previously viewed these cases as isolated incidents, began to see the impact far greater than they had imagined. The journey of these young women, brutally interrupted, seemed to follow an invisible script written by someone with a deep understanding of human behavior, someone who studied not only their journeys, but also their vulnerabilities. It was as if each victim had been chosen after careful, almost scientific analysis. And this gave the crime an even more frightening dimension. This serial killer, unlike the world-renowned names, seemed to prefer the strategy of oblivion. He didn't seek fame. He didn't want recognition. His weapon was precisely silence. This mentality, focused on obscurity, made him even more difficult to track, because there were no statements, no letters sent to the police, no criminal vanity. He simply did and disappeared, leaving behind shattered families and interrupted investigations. The biggest shock came when they realized that, in the region where the student disappeared, there were already old reports of very similar cases, the same gaps in the leads, the same flaws at the beginning of the investigation, the same banal circumstances turned tragic. This raised a disturbing question. Was her disappearance just another in a larger sequence that had been unfolding for years, under everyone's eyes, but never recognized as the work of a single man? Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding who this suspect really was requires looking beyond the reports and delving into the revelations that show not only what he did, but how he managed to remain in the shadows for so long, escaping the radar of justice and shaping a trajectory of crimes that almost no one knows about. Comment. This makes sense to me. Twists and turns began to emerge when the seemingly stagnant investigation received a breath of fresh air. Criminology experts were invited to analyze the case from a broader perspective, moving beyond the limitations of the initial reports. And it was then that disturbing theories began to take shape. One suggested that the young college student's disappearance might not have been the work of a serial killer, but rather a planned disappearance, carefully orchestrated to appear to be the result of chance. This idea, absurd at first glance, began to make sense when one observed her routine, her schedule, and her movements, which almost always followed the same pattern. To a skilled predator, it was as if she herself had left an invisible trail to follow. But there was also another line of reasoning that intrigued investigators: the possibility that she had disappeared of her own volition, an escape. This theory was supported by subtle details of her personal life, minor family conflicts, academic pressures, and the emotional overload that was not uncommon among university students. Some classmates even claimed she talked about starting over, moving to a new city, seeking a complete life transformation. But this version clashed with the deep affection she demonstrated for her family, the loving way she maintained daily contact with her mother, and the project she had begun for the following semester. Was it possible that a young woman so connected to the people around her had simply vanished without leaving even a letter, a clue, a trace? Another, even more disturbing theory was gaining traction behind the scenes of the investigation, that she had become yet another victim of that little-known serial killer, the same one who silently stalked the region and had already been linked to other similar cases. The combination of circumstances, the deserted location, the absence of direct witnesses, the lack of material evidence, fit this man's profile perfectly. What no one realized at the time may be the key to understanding not only her fate, but also the true scope of the crimes attributed to this man who operated far from the spotlight. Amid this tangle of possibilities, old reports began to resurface, revealing details that seemed forgotten. One mentioned the presence of a dark, unmarked car parked near the university on at least 3 different nights. Witnesses claimed to have seen the same male figure exiting the vehicle and discreetly observing the students' movements. At the time, this information was considered irrelevant, but years later, when revisited, it gained much greater significance. It wasn't just an isolated detail, but rather a pattern that could be repeated in other cases in the region. Criminal behavior experts further suggested that the suspect's modus operandi was more sophisticated than previously thought. He didn't just attack. He studied his victims, adapted his approach, and patiently shaped his decisions, like someone writing a secret script and then executing it behind the scenes in real life. This revelation led many to begin to see the investigation differently, understanding that it wasn't just about finding obvious clues, but about deciphering the mindset of someone who used invisibility as his greatest weapon. Each new theory seemed to bring both enlightenment and confusion. While it brought closer to a possible hidden truth, it also opened the door to further doubts and contradictions. The emotional impact on the family was devastating. They oscillated between hope that she had fled by choice and despair at the possibility that she had been the victim of something much darker. This duality reinforced the mystery, maintaining the sense that each revelation was only the tip of the iceberg, and that the answers still lay hidden somewhere deeper. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because it is at this point that theories cease to be just hypotheses and intersect with concrete evidence, generating new questions that to this day remain unanswered. Right there, I'm on this journey too. The consequences of this disappearance were far more profound than most people initially imagined. It wasn't just a college student who vanished. It was an entire life interrupted, dreams shelved, family ties fractured, and an entire community shaken. Her family plunged into a painful transformation, living each day as if suspended between 2 realities, the hope of a reunion and the anguish of never having answers. The psychological impact on her parents was devastating, and her siblings carried the invisible weight of living with her constant absence. It wasn't just the physical absence, but also the emotional wound that never healed, a void that infiltrated everyday decisions and altered everyone's mindset. At the university, the atmosphere changed completely. Hallways that were once bustling with life and routine became scenes of suspicious silence. Students began rethinking their schedules, professors altered procedures, and even the administrative staff was forced to review security protocols. The disappearance was no longer just a personal tragedy, but a reflection of how a single event can destabilize an entire network of relationships. This generated debates, assemblies, reports, and even awareness campaigns, but at the same time, it brought to the surface an uncomfortable feeling of powerlessness. After all, how can we trust preventive measures when someone simply vanishes without a trace? And the weight of this mystery wasn't limited to an academic space. The surrounding community also transformed. Small local businesses, bars frequented by university students, long-time residents of the area. Everyone began to carry a mix of fear and distrust. Rumors began to circulate. Stories of other disappearances, reports of people claiming to have seen strange figures prowling dimly lit streets, and with each new detail, uncertainty grew. This wasn't just an isolated case, but rather part of a dark web of events that seemed to repeat itself in different places, as if following an invisible pattern. It was at this point that investigators began to connect the disappearance to little-known crimes linked to the same serial killer already under suspicion. Old cases, filed away as accidents or voluntary escapes, began to be revisited. The details were eerily similar. College-aged young people, nighttime commutes, a lack of direct witnesses, and a strange lack of material evidence. It was as if someone had coldly calculated each step, leaving behind only the echo of unanswered questions. This parallel further heightened the gravity of the student's disappearance. If there was indeed a connection to other crimes, it meant the problem wasn't a one-off, but rather part of a dark journey that spanned years and different cities. And this idea evoked a hidden truth that was difficult to accept. Perhaps we were dealing with a killer far more organized, patient and lethal than authorities were willing to admit at the time. For the family, each new theory brought both hope and suffering. Hope, because it meant there might be a concrete line of investigation. Suffering, because every detail linked their daughter to stories of victims who never had a chance to return. The academic community also lived this same contradiction. They wanted answers, but feared that the answer would confirm that the young woman had become part of a grim statistic. This combination of silence, pain, and collective fear kept the memory of the case alive, transforming it into a kind of imprint etched in local history. And to this day, whenever someone mentions the student's name, the impact is still felt, not just as a memory, but as a reminder that there are hidden truths that, even after so many years, continue to elude human comprehension. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because the consequences of this mystery did not stop with the victim's closest circle. They echoed far and wide and revealed disturbing connections that almost no one noticed at the time. Comment. This makes sense to me. Perfect. I'll continue directly from the previous section, maintaining the same narrative rhythm, the same emotional intensity, and following the rules you outlined. The text will be about 7,000 characters and will be written in an engaging tone, like a frank conversation, leaving a natural bridge to the next stage of the script. Here it is. It's curious how time passes, but certain marks remain like open scars in the collective memory. This particular case wasn't just an isolated tragedy, but a silent turning point that altered the perception of an entire community. Parents who once allowed their children to roam freely around campus began demanding rides. Neighbors who never locked their doors now reinforced their locks, and the light-hearted atmosphere of a university environment transformed into something fraught with distrust. That space, which should have been a symbol of the future, of personal transformation and new opportunities, began to carry the constant shadow of uncertainty. It was as if the university had been ripped from its innocence and forced to face the cruel backstage of reality. Families, in turn, experienced an even more profound impact. Grief over absence mixed with the lack of answers, creating an unbearable void. Some parents immersed themselves in tireless campaigns, distributing posters, giving interviews, and demanding that authorities reopen investigations. Others, consumed by silence, simply disappeared from public life, as if each appearance were a reminder of the wound that never healed. This difference in mindset among family members reflects how grief shapes each person uniquely. Some seek strength in exposure, others in absolute withdrawal. Most disturbing, however, is how this case echoed other stories, connecting with a chain of events that seemed to form an invisible pattern. Later reports suggest the region had already recorded similar disappearances, but many were forgotten in local newspapers, lost to time. And when independent investigators began comparing the details, coincidences emerged that were too disturbing to ignore. Young people in similar circumstances, their routines disrupted in the same way, and in every scenario, the same void. No definitive answer. The theory that a serial killer might have been at work at the time resurfaced with a vengeance. Some experts, in interviews years later, stated that the psychological profile of the disappearances pointed to this: a calculating mind, someone who knew how to manipulate the environment around them, who was well acquainted with university routines, and knew how to act without leaving a trace. A former FBI agent even stated that what no one noticed at the time may be the key to the case, suggesting that small, overlooked details, such as reports of cars parked for long periods in unusual places or strange people discreetly observing campus activity, could have been clear signs that something much larger was going on. But it's not just about serial killers. Another line of investigation raises the hypothesis of grooming networks, something even more disturbing, as it would open the door to the idea that this wasn't the work of a single individual, but rather organized groups operating behind the scenes. This theory, although more difficult to prove, was supported by journalists who investigated old police files and found inconsistencies in the testimonies of some witnesses. Small contradictions, sentences that didn't fit together, and even reports that certain evidence was misplaced in the process. The feeling remains that the hidden truth could have been deliberately suppressed, and while all this was circulating, the community carried the weight of doubt. Students at the university at the time say they began to experience a kind of collective paranoia. Nighttime meetings, silent protests, candlelight vigils in front of the main building, everyone sought in some way to transform that pain into a symbolic act of resistance. The message was clear: a disappearance cannot be allowed to be swallowed up in oblivion. Similar cases in other cities only reinforced the mystery. For example, reports of young people disappearing under nearly identical circumstances hundreds of miles away began to surface in smaller news reports, raising questions. Was this the work of the same person, moving from state to state, or simply macabre coincidences that seemed to echo one another? This parallel only heightened the emotional impact and made it clear that this wasn't just a story about one victim, but about a sequence of events that could reveal a much broader web. What's most striking is that, despite the decades that have passed, the official investigation has never managed to provide concrete answers. With each new attempt to reopen the case, the same scenario repeats itself: promises of review, impactful interviews, experts presenting new revelations, but no definitive conclusion. It's as if the truth itself were buried under layers of silence, protected by forces we may never have the courage to fully confront. This silence, however, is precisely what keeps the mystery alive. Because when there's no explanation, the human mind tries to fill the gaps with its own narratives, creating a multitude of competing versions. And amidst this maze of hypotheses, what persists most is the unease. Will we ever know what really happened? Or are we facing one of those cases destined to remain forever in the shadows, where every detail seems like a clue, but none leads to a solution? Now, I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because what many people don't realize is that these mysteries aren't just recorded in police files, but also infiltrate local culture, behaviors, family conversations, and even small everyday decisions. They shape how people view safety, trust, and even the very freedom to live. This is the true impact of a never-ending story. It doesn't limit itself to the past, but continues to shape the present in subtle and disturbing ways. And it is precisely at this point that the inevitable question arises, one that still echoes like an uncomfortable whisper: will the truth ever be revealed? Or will this mystery remain forever hidden in the shadows, like a wound that time refuses to heal? Right there. I'm on this journey too. So if you've made it this far, you've already realized that these kinds of stories aren't just about what happened in the past, but about the impact that lives on in the present, shaking our perceptions of safety, trust, and even truth itself. That's precisely why I keep bringing these cases to light, because every detail, every revelation, and every reflection helps paint a bigger picture worth exploring. If this content resonated with you, if it somehow sparked your curiosity, or made you think about things that normally go unnoticed, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss the next stories and can continue this journey with me, delving deeper and deeper into these seemingly endless mysteries. And since you've reached the end, leave this sentence in the comments. I'm with you until the end. I want to see who actually followed this entire investigation down to the last detail. Oh, and don't forget to leave your like too. It's more than just a button. It's my way of letting you know this conversation resonated with you and that it's worth continuing to bring you content like this with the same intensity and care. And if you still want to dive deeper, there's a video right here that complements this topic. Click and stay with me there. The story isn't over yet.